In this activity, we're going to learn some new CSS. We're going to learn how to do shadows, what the different positioning values do and how they work, how to do transitions, so how to make things smoothly change over time on a hover. Anyway, let's get started with shadows. So there are two different types of shadows. One is a box shadow and one is a text shadow. And we're going to working in this section here, which is the leading section. And let's go ahead and start with a box shadow. So now when you do with a shadow, it has several different, I'm using the shorthand version, that's just the one I prefer. You can do individual properties if you want. But it does first the horizontal width, and so I can say, okay, I want it to be 2 pixels is the shadow I want, 2 pixels wide on the horizontal line, and I want it to be 2 pixels long on the vertical line. Then the next value is the blur. How much do you want it to blur? And so I'm just going to put 4 pixels here, and then the color. So I'm going to go up here and capture one of the colors that we have. Come back down and add a color. Okay, so those are the 4 properties that I'm going to add on that, and then we come over here and let's see what kind of change happens. There we go. See how we got that shadow along the horizontal edge, along the vertical edge? Now let's play with it for just a minute to see how those sizes change. So let's go ahead and make the one on the horizontal edge bigger that we can see it. And there you go. It just gets, it's truly bigger, right? What about if we do the blur? Now the blur is going to apply to both. Let's make a really big blur. And that just, see how it makes it blurrier. And the smaller the number, the less blurry it is. Okay, so that kind of gives you a feel for that. Another interesting thing about that, I'm going to put these down to, let's do this and see what that looks like. Now you can put additional shadows, so you can do more than one. To do that, you simply put a comma and do another one. Now this time I want to do a horizontal one over here on the left and a vertical one on the top. You still only get a value for vertical and horizontal, but if you use a negative horizontal value, it goes left, and a negative vertical value, it goes up. So here if I use a -2 pixels, a -2 pixels, and blur, I want them just as blurry, I think, so I'll do the 8 pixels. By the way, code along. This is how you'll learn, is that you do it as we go. So go ahead and code along so you get this finished product as we go, and you can pause it as you want. All right, there, notice how now I have that shadow there. And I could add another one behind this, like if you wanted a different color one, so you can go ahead and go with lots of different shadows. Now the other kind of shadow is a text shadow, and I want to do that up here on this heading 3 that's in here. So I'm going to create another box that is leading, so that's in that leading section, but I want it to apply specifically to the heading 3 that's in there, and use the text shadow. Now the text shadow works the same as far as the properties. So let's go ahead and just start with the 4 pixel that we had, and the 4 pixel we had, and the 8 pixel, but this time I want to do a gray color. So I don't want to, well, let's just do the one what we had. So we see that first, and then we'll make changes. But this one, so I'm going to do exactly the same that I had on that box shadow, and refresh. And there you see it happening to the letters. Notice how it takes on the shape of the letters. Okay, so it really does shadow the letters. Okay, I'm going to change this up. I want to do gray. So I'm going to do a gray is all the same numbers, and the bigger the number, the lighter the gray. So this is a pretty light gray. And there you just barely see it. If I tighten that up, if I say, hey, I don't want much blur, then you really can see the individual letters and then how far they're offset. So see, there's quite a distance between the letter and the shadow. So if I tighten that up, then I just move it this way. And there I get a shadow on the letters. Now it's really tight, so it almost just gives them depth. All right, there's how you do shadows. So I'm going to start, the first thing I want to do shadows on this image too. Now notice this was a section, so we can go look at the code to find that. So as we get down here, I had that class was on a section. Now I'm looking at an image. I have the class actually on the image. So I want to make a change to the image. And that's this image right here that doesn't even really look like an image, right? So I want to put a box shadow on it. So I'm going to start with this. I am going to want it all the way around, so I'm going to add two properties. But this one I also want to be gray. So I'm going to change the color to gray. And I don't want it quite as blurry, so I'm going to go 4 here, and I'll leave it blurry down there. Let's see what we've got going on here. Oh, that didn't work. Let's figure out what we did wrong. Oh, I'm missing a curly brace somehow. I must have copied that out of there. Erased it. Okay, so now notice how that just lifted that off the page and gave it a little bit of distance, like texture. Depth is, I guess, the right word for that. Gives it depth. Now I want to move it off of the edge a bit, so I'm going to put margin left over there. About 24 pixels. Okay, so you can do lots of interesting things with shadows. So another fun property is rounding borders, right? Doing a border radius. Now we've done that. Notice that we've done that in the as we've done navigation, we've put rounded borders on those A tags, but we can also do that on an image. So let's play with this image. This image has a class set to testing on it, and we can put a border radius on it. So if we just simply go border radius, and let's go ahead and set it at 12 pixels and see what we get. There we go. We've got border radius on every one of them. So you can just do that with an image if you want to curve those edges. As you make those bigger, so if I upsize this to 24 pixels, then I can change it. Also, you can change each individual corner, kind of like we do with padding and margin. It starts, the first number is this corner, the second number is this one, the third and the fourth. So it starts in the top left and goes clockwise, and we can set each one. So let's go ahead and leave that top left one at 24 pixels, and then let's do an 80 pixel. I'm doing these big so it'll be really visible to see, and do 40 pixels and 120 pixels, and you can set each of those individually. Okay, that didn't work. Let's see what I did wrong. Oh, I made those changes on the margin left and not on the border radius. Okay, details, right? Paying attention. All right, let's see what happens. But you do it and you test it. If it doesn't turn out how you want, you know something's wrong. All right, there's 24 pixels, 80 pixels, 40 pixels, and 120 pixels. And that allows you then to set radius on an image. Okay, the next topic that we're going to talk about, and have you again work along as we do this so you can make it work on yours, is we're going to talk about position and what the position property does. So I'm going to start with this image, and I'm going to set the position to static. Now this is actually called non-positioned. It's the default, and that's what it's already set. So adding it here doesn't add any value. I just want to list it so you see what that looks like and what it means. And you see that no change there. The image in it, the position it's in is just where it is normally would be. And so we don't see any change there. And again, when it's position static, that's considered non-positioned. Another position is relative. So let's go ahead and do this one and see what relative positioning does. Now, a relative position, if we just set it and don't give it any other properties, it doesn't change at all. So what we have to do is we have to then, after we set it to relative, is we need to identify how far off of the left, top, right, or bottom we want it to be. And you can move it in two directions or just one. So let's go ahead and say we want to move it off of the left some. Let's just move it off of the left. Let's do 50 pixels. And let's move it off of the top. Oh, you need to have a colon there. And move it off of the top. Let's just do 30 pixels and see what happens. Okay, so now some things to notice. It moved it from the left 50 pixels, it moved it from the top 30 pixels. Now this is from where it was. So it's relative where its normal position would be. And let me take that back so you can see the difference. Okay, so this is where it normally would be, is right there. Okay, and notice how everything, I want you to see that this space for it stays open even if we move this way away. So let's go ahead and move this way away. Let's move the left 240 pixels, and let's move the top 60 pixels. And refresh. Okay, so it took it from right here where it was and it moved it from the left 240 pixels and from the top 60. And you see it sitting there, and everything else stayed in place. So these paragraphs are exactly where they were when we started. So we can move this all over. It maintains the original space and it doesn't move anything around. So if I did the top 160, see how it just covers things up? It just moves where it doesn't belong. It just moves it to a different location. Now watch what happens when I change these. These numbers are kind of, if I change this to bottom, what it's going to do is going to move it from its original place and make a distance from the bottom. It's going to go a distance from the bottom. So there it went 160 pixels from the bottom and still 240 from the left. Okay, so that's what relative does. Let's move that so it's not. Okay, so now you can see it moved it 240 from the left, 160, not 160, but 60 from the bottom. And that's where it is. That's what relative does. The next value we're going to try for position is fixed. So we're going to use this interrogation picture and set the position to fixed. When we do that and refresh, whoa, it's gone. Let's see if we can find it. Nope, it's just gone. So with fixed, we need to have properties like with relative from the top, left, bottom, right properties, but they're different. Number one, they're required to have it work well, but they're based on the viewport. So the viewport is the part of the view, the place where you view the web page. So it's going to be this whole rectangle is the viewport. And when we put a property, it's going to say based on the viewport, move from the top, and let's move from the top 240 pixels and see what we get. Oh, I forgot a colon there. Let's get that in there. That won't work without it. Okay, refresh. And there it is. So now it's moving it from the top 240 pixels. And notice when we move the page itself, it doesn't change because where it's located is based on the viewport, and the viewport isn't changing. The page is moving through the viewport, but the viewport itself is not changing. I can also say move it from the left, and let's move it from the left 60 pixels. And there we have it. Okay, another thing you can do, notice it just stays based on that viewport. This is a fixed position. Another choice that you can make is whether you want it to be on top of the other elements or behind. And the way that you do that is with the Z index. So I can set the z-index. The smaller the z-index, the further back it goes. So right now it's just set at a basic 1. So let's go ahead and put a negative z-index here. And that will make it less than all the others default. And so now it's behind. Notice how it can be hidden all the way by that image, but it's behind. So we have the choice to make it on top of or behind. So let's go ahead and say that we want it to be on top of them. So I'm going to be on top. I'm going to add a positive number to put it on top and make sure that it stays on top. And let's move it up here to this top right corner. Let's say I want it all the way in this corner. That means I want it off the top 0. So I'm going to say 0 off the top and 0 off the left. And save that and refresh. Oh, off the left. I want it off the right. There, it did it off the left. I want it off the right. There you go. It's kind of backwards the way they do it, but it's how far away from the right side you want it to be. Now I've got a little bit of space there. What this is that's that 15 pixel margin that we have all around. So I'm going to take that off because I want it to really be there. So I'm going to do margin right. And I'm going to set it to 0. Remember, when you're using 0, you don't need to have a unit. There we go. Now I've got it off of the top 0, off of the right 0, and I've eliminated the margin so it bumps right up against there. I've done the z-index, so it's going to stay on top. So as we scroll down or up, that's going to just stay on the top. And it's fixed is positioned in the viewport. The last position property that we're going to do is the absolute. So absolute position, here we'll do this to this last one. And we're talking about this picture here, and when I refresh it, it doesn't do, oh, look, it did do something. When it's absolute, notice how it's lifted out of place. That's another thing to note. When we use fixed, notice it was lifted out of place and its place was not saved. So relative is the only one that saves its space, but the fixed does not save its space, and neither does the absolute. So absolute also uses top right and that, but its position is based on the position on the element that is styled, not styled, positioned. So it's parent, let me get this right. So absolute also uses top right, bottom left properties to identify where its position is, but it is based off the first ancestor that has a position set. So if we look at the ancestors of this particular image, so here we are at explanation. So here's this image. Its first parent is this section, explanation. Its next parent, if we go up, ooh, all those sections are siblings, not parents. Its next parent is body, all right? And then HTML after that. So if I don't, and notice that its first parent doesn't have any, right? This section doesn't have any position set. It has no position. It has static, the default, so it's not set. So if I do a top here of 60 pixels, and let's go ahead and do a left, how far off of the left that we want it. And let's see what happens to this. Okay, it's gone, but it isn't lost. It's up here. It's doing it off the body. So if it does not have an ancestor that has a position set, it will do it off of the body. So here it's doing it from the top of the body and the left of the body. 60 pixels from the top, 80 pixels from the left. But notice it stays right with the body. So it's relative to the body. Okay, not the viewport. So what we can do, if we want it to be attached to the body that way, we can. If that's the case, you probably would put it up there. Also notice that it's not preserved, so its space is not preserved. Like the fixed one didn't save the space, just the relative one saved its space. So what we can do is we can say, well, let's go ahead and set a position on its parent. So we can do this with the explanation. So we go, and I'm going to set the position to relative, because this one doesn't do anything if we don't put the properties, like doesn't go away like fixed did. So let's go ahead and just set it to relative, and there we go. So in that section, right, in that explanation section, there's a header, there's a paragraph, and there's an image. So notice that the image that we set absolute is taken out, right? There's the header, there's the paragraph, and the image is no longer doesn't take up space in that section, but it's positioned based on that section. So it is currently, let's look and see what the values are. It is currently 60 pixels from the top of that section and 80 pixels from the left. Okay, let's move that over here so we can see it better. Oh, and notice that it moves with it, right? It's based on how that section moves, so it moves with it. Let's go ahead and take it from the right 80 pixels instead of the left. So we'll take it from the right. All right, so that section goes clear over to the side, so it's from the right 80 pixels and from the top 60 pixels. Okay, so those are the 4 position properties. Each behave just a little bit different. The next property we're going to learn about, aren't these fun properties? The next property we're going to learn about is the transition property. So notice up here that when we hover, it changes the background color, and that's what we expect. Notice how it changes it all at once. It goes from that one blue to the other blue. Just as soon as I hover, it happens all at once. Well, with transition, we can make that happen over time. So give it more of a smoothness. So if I go up to, let's see if I can find the nav section. There we go. So up here, nav hover, it's changing the background color on that A hover. And that's what I want to change. So if I set up here in the A tag, if I set the transition property, the first thing I can say in transition is, what property do I want to? What we're saying here is, whenever this property changes, change it with this transition. So here we're going to talk about, the property we're talking about is the background property. If I spell it right, it changes color. There's the background property, and then I'm saying transition it, and I can say over time. So I'm going to say take 2 seconds to make that transition. When you change the background, take 2 seconds to change it. Okay, so that's all I did, is I said whenever you change background, take 2 seconds to make that transition. And I save that and I come back over here. Now when I hover over it, instead of changing all at once, it takes 2 seconds. Notice that it happens both when I hover, it takes 2 seconds to change the background color, and when I unhover, it takes 2 seconds to change the background color. So whenever the background property of that A tag changes, it will take 2 seconds to do it. And that creates a transition to be able to do that. Okay, let's keep going. Let's go down to this interleave practice and let's learn about what the transform property does. So if I go back down here to interleaved, and I say I want to do a transform property. So transform has 3 different functions that happen, and they vary, right? There's skew or skew x, which can skew the x and y, or skew, there's a bunch of them. Let me show you a few of them. I'm going to show you the skew x. So there, see how we have skew, skew x, and skew y. I want to do the skew x, and I say, how much do you want to skew it? And I want to skew it 30 degrees, and you do degrees, D-E-G. So, and this just takes it and it transforms the element. Now I'm doing it to images. You can do it to other things. It doesn't just have to be an image. It can be a heading, it can be a paragraph, whatever. You can transform an element. I'm transforming an image here because it's very visible to see what happens. And there, notice what it did. It skewed it with the X direction. It took the regular X location and it skewed the top and the bottom X positions away from each other. And we did it by 30 degrees. We can do it by 10 degrees. Right? Not so much. We can do it by more degrees and skew it a whole bunch. Like a whole bunch. All right. So let's go back to 30. And there we get that. And that's what that transform skew does. Transform also has the option to rotate. Let's try that with this picture. So if we do the transform, and now that we're going to do rotate, and again it has lots of different options for rotating, but I'm going to just rotate the plain one, and I'm going to do it 35 degrees. And this one is, see how that it just rotates that element. I can use a negative number here too, and it rotates the other way. Okay, so transform takes an element and it transforms it some way. Okay, now let's combine these two. Let's combine the transition and the transform. So notice that the transform is happening, it's just the way the page is built. So when it first displays, when it last displays, there's no movement on it, right? But what about if we do it on hover? So let's go ahead and set the interrogation on hover. So I'm going to play with this image up here. And I'm going to say on hover, I want it to do something. All right, so to do that, I have to do the dot interrogation. Let me capture it so I don't misspell it. But I'm going to say when we hover over it. All right, when we hover over it, I want it to transform. Okay, so I'm putting the transform in the hover category, and that gives it a different timing. It doesn't happen when the page loads, but it only happens when you hover over it. So it's going to transform, and now I'm going to use the scale. And the scale transform properties, again, there's a variety of them. This changes the size. So I'm going to scale this, and I want it to change by 1.5. So I'm going to use a 1.5 scale. So let's go ahead and see what happens here. So the transform scale. So this is only going to happen when I hover, so no change here. But as soon as I hover, it gets bigger. See that? It's bigger. And so, and that's how transform works in a hover selector. Okay, so now let's go ahead and do the transition to make that be more smooth. So we know that with the transition, we say what property, when a property changes, how do you want it to change? And with the property that's going to change is the transform property. And we want to say, do this over 3 seconds. So whenever you change the transform property, take some time to do it. So here we refresh. Now when I hover, it changes size, but it changes over 3 seconds. How about that? There you go. Now notice what's happening. Because that's scaling it from where it is, it's no longer attached to the top or the bottom. So let's go ahead and not only change that, let's change the top property. And let's say, hey, we want this top to be more off of we want more distance off the top so we can see all of that. So I'm going to move that top off there 50 pixels and see what happens. So it's, okay, now did you see it? It happened as soon as I hovered, it went off the top 50 pixels and then it filled it up. All right, so that worked. Let's go ahead and do say we want to come off the right as well so we don't lose that right side. And I've already done the math to figure out these exactly. So here we go, 75. Okay, so as soon as I hover, it comes off of the right 75, off of the top 50, and then it grows to fill that. Well, let's go ahead and make those transition as well. So up here, you can do more than one in a transition. Let's say we'll do the top is the property I want to specify, and I want you to spend 3 seconds whenever you change the top property. And let's do the right. And let's say that on the right, we also want to do 3 seconds. Whenever you transition the right property, do 3 seconds. So we specified 3 different properties to change the transform. And let's go see how that works. Now when I hover, they're going to transition. See how they all transition at the same speed and then transition back. So fun things you can do with all these new properties. We have the position property, the shadows property, the rounded borders property, and then these new properties transform and then transition to allow us to identify how we want to transition from one to the other. Fun properties to add to your CSS toolkit.